Well, good afternoon once again, everybody. Welcome back to my digital history conference. It's been 5 years since I've done one, and I was so glad to have some great presenters on today. We have our last presenter with us right now. Michael E. Carter is going to be talking about the Paxton Boys, the anatomy of 18th century genocide. Michael is an adjunct professor of history at Keene University in Union, New Jersey. He earned his BA in history from Keene in 2015 and an MA in Holocaust and Genocide Studies from Keene in 2018. His upcoming book chapter is entitled Historians and Genocide Seeking an Alternative Model of Justice. I'm sorry, I don't know why my coffee hasn't kicked in today, which is going to be published in Justice After Atrocity. And this is a very important topic. And I was so glad that Michael sent me an abstract during my call for papers because I feel like this is something that we need to discuss. So, Michael, please take it away, my friend. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for being here. Thank you for letting me be here. I didn't have any coffee either. Um, I'm very happy to be here. Everyone knows that when you come to a digital conference on 1775, you really want to talk about December of 1763. So what we're talking about today is an incident, two incidents that is one greater incident, the genocide of the Conestoga Indians. And if you've never heard about the Conestoga Indians before, that's not surprising. It's not something I learned about until only a handful of years ago, and I think it's one of, if not the most important topic in the overall era, season, whatever you want to tack onto it, of revolution. So let's get to what we have as the background for the destruction of these peaceful indigenous people in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, is the violence of Pontiac's rebellion or Pontiac's war. In the aftermath of the French and Indian Wars, in the aftermath of the Greater 7 Years' War, and the driving out of the French colonial interest in North America, what we have is the outrage of their indigenous allies, chiefly among them the Ottawa war chief known to history as Pontiac. And this war pretty much kicks off exactly as the French and Indian War ends. And who get caught in the middle of all of this are the frontier people of Pennsylvania, who are of a particular ethnic origin, the Scots-Irish, from the Ulster Highlands of Ireland, who have pretty much settled the frontier of the young, well, I wouldn't say they're young British colonies, but the America to be. Let's tack that name onto it. And what you end up happening is the violence or the uprising, excuse me, occurring in the greater Great Lakes, Ohio region under Pontiac. And you have this particularly sort of rough and tumble, violent, Indian hating sort of frontiersman society among the Scots-Irish of the Pennsylvania frontier. And those that get caught in the middle are a group known as the Conestoga. The Conestoga, to make a fairly long story about the rise and fall of an indigenous empire, short for our amount of time, are one of, if not the last group of the Susquehannock people, a major power in the mid-Atlantic that, due to various wars against their indigenous rivals, chiefly among them the Haudenosaunee, who you may be more familiar with as the Iroquois Confederacy, as well as colonial forces in Maryland and Virginia, basically crumbled and basically sectioned off remnants of themselves primarily into the territory of the Haudenosaunee and elsewhere. One of these holdouts ended up in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where they became known as the Conestoga, as they occupied a tract of 16,000 acres known as the Conestoga Manor or the Conestoga Indian Town. Okay. So These were peaceful, local friendly trading indigenous people along the Susquehannock River. They, again, made no issue for their Pennsylvania neighbors. In 1701, they made an agreement, a treaty of friendship and peace with William Penn himself, a treaty that they would hold on to for their entire history. And their main interest in the region was surviving. Not that they were constantly under threat, but having their community survive. This is where they collide with the tumult of the French and Indian War and then Pontiac's Rebellion. Because in the same general region of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, in Lancaster County, there was what can really only be described as a death squad of an Indian killing militia that call themselves the Paxton Boys. They've also been referred to as the Paxton Rangers or the Paxton Boys or the Paxton Rangers. There's a couple of variants, but we're talking about the Paxton Boys. And they were too few in number to actually muster up a defense. At least that was their view, that there were too few of them to defend against Pontiac and its heathen hordes that were going to come and kill other women and burn their crops and whatever it is frontiersmen are afraid of. So they decide that they are going to go into the offensive. They go into two different offensives and fail both times. One, they are ambushed and they lose more men than they are able to actually kill. And one other time, if I recall correctly, they don't find any indigenous people at all, and they're so frustrated that they find a couple of indigenous traders leaving a town, so they murder them and take the fur they were carrying. These were not, brave heroes of the frontier. These were cowards and these were murderers. So having fundamentally failed in their quest to take the war to Pontiac and their enemies, they are chomping at the bit for some sort of vengeance and some sort of easy target. So with the war against Pontiac brewing, they devise a conspiracy theory. They devise the theory that the people of the Conestoga Manor, the Conestoga people, are aiding and abetting the enemy, that they are providing intelligence of the local people of Lancaster so that when an Indian raid comes, they will be ill prepared. So, organized by their leader, John Elder, and others, and they decide to attack Conestoga Manor on December 14th, 1763. There's been a blizzard. They rode all through the night, about 60 miles down along the Susquehannock River from where they originated. At daybreak, they attacked the town. 57 armed frontiersmen, led by one named Matthew Smith, armed with flintlock, hanger blades, which is sort of a short sword. If you really need any real comparison, if you ever think of like a stereotypical pirate sword, not a cutlass, like a straight edge kind of, think of that. It's a hanger blade, and hatchets. They arrived to a town when it only had 6 inhabitants. The other 14 or so had departed to engage in a trade endeavor and got slowed down by the blizzard. They weren't going to let the fact that the majority of the manor was away stop them from carrying out their objective. They murdered the 2 men, the 3 women, and the boy that they found. The older man among them that they killed was named Shahays, who was a witness to the 1701 Treaty of Friendship between his people and William Penn. He was hacked to death in his bed. So I kind of forgot to move the slide over. So this is some typical these guys would typically be wearing. This is a Minuteman sword from the Revolution, which is a pretty good example of a hanger blade. Sorry, I was staring at the map and monologuing. So here is a graphic novel of a semi-fictitious depiction of the Conestoga Massacre. Here is an anachronistic Victorian depiction of the same event. So the Paxtons, having murdered their 6 people, mutilated their bodies, scalped them all, and looted whatever they could carry and belt onto their horses. Whatever they couldn't carry, they burned. One of the things they looted was a child's toy gun. There was no minimum of what they wouldn't take as some sort of trophy. One anecdote. Sorry, I moved a little bit ahead. One anecdote was that among the belief that these were heathens, that these were enemies of the Commonwealth, that they were spying on the enemy, that they were acting against the interests of their neighbors. One anecdotal accusation, was that the Conestoga had stolen a pewter spoon and melted it down, and therefore that was at least one of the grievances the Paxtons had against them. A pewter spoon, a single spoon, at that time would have probably been worth about 3 pence, which if we adjust it for inflation and make British pence into US dollars, that's less than $2. So 6 people were murdered for a host of reasons, including the alleged theft of less than $2. And I did misspeak. This is an anachronistic version of what's going to happen next. So the Conestoga were placed under government protection after this. They were relocated because their town was burned. They were relocated to a workhouse, sometimes referred to as a jail, in downtown Lancaster, all 17 of them. After Christmas, on December 27, 1763, the Paxtons rode into town to finish what they started. Now, remember, these are not just people living out in the frontier now. These are people under government protection in the middle of the city. 50 or 60 Paxtons, although some outlier accounts say there were 25 of them. Some people say there were 200. They were most likely between 50 and 60. Rode in on horseback, armed with long guns, hatchets, and scalping knives. While the city luminaries were almost all within the church, engaging in continued Christmas service, their chaos brought a crowd to form around the workhouse, including the sheriff, but no one intervened on the part of the Conestogas. The Paxtons broke into the workhouse unabated, chased the people hiding within into the snow, and then murdered and mutilated them there. I misspoke before. This is an anachronistic depiction of the Lancaster Workhouse Massacre. The Paxtons, having done all this, had left among their other property the 1701 treaty, or at least a copy of it that they possessed, lying there among the corpses, decided that this was a time of celebration. They got back onto their horses, rode around the Lancaster courthouse, firing their guns into the air before riding off. This was an absolute disregard for colonial authority, disregard for the city, disregard for the Commonwealth. And it's important to put this into context. We think of Lancaster, Pennsylvania now in the context of every other city that exists in Pennsylvania and the country. In 1760, Lancaster was the largest inland city among the colonies. To ride in this manner, to intimidate its locals, to commit the murder of 14 people and then ride off firing off their guns would have been inconceivable. The Paxtons themselves were convinced that they had done something greater than anyone before them. Greater than Pompey Magnus, greater than Julius Caesar, greater than Alexander the Great. This is their words. One of them was bragging on. Because they had wiped out an entire tribe, an entire nation themselves. They were wrong. Aside from a few anecdotes that have floated around the centuries, excuse me, as kind of local myth, there is some weight to the fact that 2 Conestogas may have survived because they were not at the manor, Indian town, or the workhouse. They were on the farm of their friends and neighbors. Their Christianized names were Michael and Mary, and according to the story, they were neighbors and friends to Mennonites that happened to be members of the now famous Hershey family, and therefore they were able to survive. They were placed under protection of the government themselves, and they lived happy lives. And they, when they pass, there's the grave for them that the family still sort of tends to this day. The aftermath of this, again, is brutal. I haven't been naming a lot of names, and that's because most of the people responsible for this atrocity, aside from the people that we knew were leading the Paxton Boys in leadership positions, such as John Elder and the aforementioned Matthew Smith, basically wrote off into history anonymously. No one really named them. They weren't, a lot of the accounts you find is, oh, this Paxton said this and this Paxton said that. You don't get like, oh yeah, that was John the Butcher and he's the thing that he did. That isn't really there. But Benjamin Franklin, my personal favorite founding father, and this is for one of those reasons, he put together a pamphlet called The Narrative of the Late Massacres in Lancaster County. And among other things, he basically made the point that the Paxtons would have been safer anywhere else in the world. Anywhere in Europe, anywhere in Africa, anywhere in the Middle East, anywhere in Asia, anywhere in the world, except that the fact that they were unfortunately living next to the Christian white savages of Paxton. Ben Franklin's role in all this continues. Because that pamphlet was January 30th, was published January 30th, 1764, by the way. The Paxtons are emboldened. And just to sort up, because I think we only have so much time left, the Paxtons were emboldened, and they decide, if we can get away with this, then we can march on the city of Philadelphia itself, and we are going to do the exact same thing to the Moravian indigenous that are under guard in the city itself on Providence Island. We're going to literally march on the capital. And Philadelphia prepared for the coming offensive by the group now calling themselves the Hickory Boys. They mustered their numbers. Although, as you could see, even from this period artistic piece, they were still referred to as the Paxtons. That's the name that stuck. Franklin was offered a command by the governor, which Franklin refused because he didn't want there to be any confusion over who was in charge. He wanted the governor's authority in the city to be unquestioned. The Paxtons rode into the town to the north of Philadelphia, Germantown, and terrorized the residents, poking the holes of their muskets through doorways and windows to terrify women. They would drag men out of their homes and beat them and engage in mock scalpings. These are white Pennsylvanians. These are settlers. Because blended up in all this is this hatred of the government, hatred of the indigenous, hatred of the Quakers, hatred that the fact that they're not in charge. So they're tormenting the people of Germantown to the point where polymath David Rittenhouse, who was literally living in this town, said, I had seen hundreds of indigenous people pass through here. No one has ever acted as savagely as these Paxtons. The Paxtons decide to do a little recon. Their leader, Matthew Smith, basically sneaks into Philadelphia, sees all the fortifications, has a conversation with William Penn secretly, and basically realizes that we're walking into a massacre. This isn't going to be good for us. So they basically wait back in Germantown for a parley. And Franklin is sent with a sort of delegation. All right, up there's Germantown, there's Philadelphia. See, this is my bad. I always get caught up in the talk. Yeah, so this is what David Rittenhouse actually said in full. About 50 of the scoundrels marched by my workshop. I've seen hundreds of Indians travel in the county. I can with truth affirm that the behavior of these fellows was 10 times more savage and brutal than theirs. And then he talks about what I said about the aforementioned beatings and torment. So Benjamin Franklin leads this assorted delegation. They sort out the matter with the Paxtons. But it's really important that we point out one finer detail. Benjamin Franklin was hated by these people. They saw him as a fraud. They saw him as a political opportunist. They saw him as a Quaker lover and a sympathizer to Indians. It is very likely that in a slightly different form, a very slightly altered history, Benjamin Franklin was walking into his own death. But he did it for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. He did it for his city. He did it because, based on what he wrote in that pamphlet, he did it because it was right. The rebellion was quelled. And the Moravian Indians that were in the city spent about, between the French and Indian War, Pontiac's Rebellion, and this occurring within Pontiac's Rebellion, spent about a year and a half under guard. And while under that, 56 of them died. So while under government protection, not even being murdered like the Conestoga were under government protection, simply being exposed to the starvation and the disease conditions of quote unquote protection, more than twice as many Moravians died as the Conestoga who were murdered. So this was still, even in victory, not a good situation for them to be in. In the aftermath of all of this, Benjamin Franklin wrote to his friend and colonial agent in Britain, Richard Jackson, in February of 1764. And he said this: "In the last I mentioned to you the rioting on our frontiers, in which 20 peaceful Indians were killed, who had lived quietly among us. The spirit of killing all Indians, friends and foes, spread amazingly through the whole country. The action was almost universally approved of by the common people." And I know we only have so much of time left, so I'll try to speed through this last bit. What occurs as a direct result of the massacres and then the uprising, and more strikingly, Benjamin's own publication, we have the pamphlet war over this. Basically, 63 pamphlets arguing for and against whether or not the Paxtons were right. It was about 20% of all Pennsylvanian publications in 1764, and even surpassed the pamphlet debate that was also ongoing about the Stamp Act. So I said at the beginning of all this, you may never have heard of the Conestoga. You may never have heard of this massacre. Yet it was a conversation louder than the one every single student in this country hears about again and again when we talk about the revolution. The legacy of the Paxtons was not a good one. Due to the basic success of their march, they got everything they wanted. And the fact that with Pontiac's war ongoing, John Penn kind of had to remake himself into this sort of colonial crusader. What ends up happening is, among other things, scalp bounties once again become legalized. So the ability to profit or murder is back on the books, which is exactly what the Paxtons wanted. Also, from March to November of 1765, you have what is called the Black Boys Rebellion, named such because they basically wore what we would now call blackface. They were a Paxton-style mob that tormented the British Army from March to November of that year. In January of 1766, about 30 Paxton veterans, led by someone who was under the cryptonym of the Captain, illegally occupied the Conestoga Indian town, despite someone already having that land given to them by the governor, and they occupied it until they were driven off by Pennsylvania soldiers. And then lastly, and probably most importantly for the larger history, is the fact that Frederick Stump and his manservant, sometimes referred to as John Ironcutter, although his name would directly translate in German to John Eisenhower, and it's very likely an ancestor to the future general and president. In January of 1768, conducted what is called the Stump's Run Massacre, where they murdered 4 indigenous men, 3 women, and 3 children, including an infant, over 2 days. After they were in prison, they were broken out by a mob of 80 men who allegedly also had Paxton affiliation on January 29, 1768. They also escaped justice. It's also more or less certain that those who had issues with the government and Indians ultimately sided almost certainly with the American Revolution as the war kicked off not so long after. I want to leave you with this, as I believe literally come to my time. The Conestoga Indian town has a monument. It's sitting on the side of a road in Millersville, Pennsylvania, next to a ranch house. There are numerous mentions around the workhouse in downtown Lancaster, including that marker, which, in my opinion, erroneously refers to it as an old jail. And then you have that right there, the grave sites of Michael. I'll say alleged, but I truly believe to be the 2 primary survivors among the Conestoga Indian town in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I want to leave you with them, not with those who were possessed by the spirit of killing all Indians. They don't deserve your memory. These people do. Thank you.
That was fantastic, Michael. Thank you so much for sharing this with us. I grew up in Franklin County, Pennsylvania, and so I'm not too far from this incident. Only a couple, about an hour's drive, maybe, from where a lot of this stuff occurred. And I have family who lived in Fort Loudon and all that stuff. So this is something that occurred that my family were in the area, at least, and most likely supportive of this kind of stuff, honestly, because that's that's the way it was then. We have to be honest about what was happening at that time. Why did you want to visit this particular topic when you were studying, when you were researching? What made it the topic of choice for you?
Overall, or for this
overall, you've done your research in genocide studies and such. What was the reasoning for wanting to highlight this, not only for my audience but for other people as well?
There's something about, and this is true in the context of New England with the praying Indians in the aftermath of King Philip's War, and that continues through the Revolutionary era and after, and you could bring it to Jackson if you really wanted to. There's something fascinating to me about the idea that there isn't anything that, I want to make sure I word this really carefully, that there isn't ever a, okay, I'm going to spin the whole thing around. The kind of people that undertook the Conestoga Genocide, these kind of Paxton Indian killer frontiersmen, you can't negotiate with them. They decided these are the, you could read poetry poetry for the era, and they're referred to them as Canaanites and heathens. Like, we're talking about the 1760s, and they're still, comparing them to Belial. Like, it's all there. Like you're reading Puritan literature. So there was no level of assimilation that worked for these people. So you could be Christianized, you could trade with your neighbors, live in what is effectively a settler colonial society. You can be completely peaceful. You can provide, whatever support you want to your neighbors, and you'll still be a heathen. You'll still be an enemy of the state. You'll still, despite what you said, you're lying, and it will murder you indiscriminately, and we'll celebrate around the courthouse and ride off, and nothing will happen to us. Mm-hmm. And we believe this so strongly, we'll go to war with the Commonwealth for it. Mm-hmm. I was struck by that. This is sort of the first topic I saw that sort of brought me into this wider question of violence against Christianized Indians. The idea that, for these people, this sort of frontier genocide mindset, there is no bar. There's no level of assimilation that works. So that's what brought me to it, because I was kind of startled. Even before I knew about this, I went to a conference in Millersville, a genocide conference. And then after that year, like a couple of months after, I was like, wait a second, why didn't I know about this? And I think that's where it kind of buried itself into my brain. Because I don't like it when things should be more broadly talked about but aren't.
Right.
Yeah. And I was like, that's why. I was like, more people have to know about this.
That's great. There's a lot of students out there and researchers who that's the moment where they're like, how dare we not talk about this? We need to talk about this, and we need to face this, because it has larger implications about the world around us, or the world we once were a part of, or whatever the case may be. I think that is, so commendable that there are those like you who do that, and I hope more will start to do that as well. The other thing that I wanted to ask you was, when you're studying this kind of thing and you've earned a master's degree in genocide studies, et cetera, how do you treat yourself, Michael? Because some people will get so engrossed in the research that they find themselves becoming, upset a lot, and they don't know how to step back for just a moment and just take a break for, a day or two or whatever. What is it like to be involved in this kind of research, this heavy research, as a researcher, as a human being, and being able to sometimes say, okay, I just have to walk away for a couple hours or a day and then come back to this, because it's got to be daunting at times.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of an answer that's serious and not just me indulging in dark humor. I'm
okay with dark humor.
No, yeah, I know, but
I get what you mean.
No, but there is. Maybe it's easier when you don't think humans can be better. That's a loaded statement. I almost forgot to say it. There comes a moment where, when you're, and this is not the opinion held by everyone. This is my sort of view.
Sure.
When you're a student of world history, and you're a student of history generally, there's patterns. Things rhyme, things echo, whatever word you want to use.
Right.
This problem keeps coming up. So at some point you have to go, is it us? Is there some wiring in this? And I don't know if that helps, but it's weird, because you're like, all right. And now it sounds like I'm not saying that this is unavoidable. I'm not saying all that, but you kind of come to accept on some level that we're not getting around this problem, or at least the way we've been trying to get around it for about the last century, it's not working. Samantha Power, who with the UN, and I have my own issues with directions she's taken, but when she wrote her book, she called it "The Problem from Hell," about genocide. That's kind of what it is. So my coping mechanism is really kind of detachment, not from the people and not from the horror, not from the story, but detachment from the question of how could this happen? Because if you step that aside, you're like, all right, well, we've been here before. We know how this happens. We know how this works mechanically. We know how this, no. Oh, they thought they were acting against them, so they justified killing them all. All right, that's the logic of genocide. One of the most scary, I almost said most scary, one of the most terrifying things about genocide, whether it's in antiquity to the point where we understand it, to the point where for the majority of recorded history, to right this moment, is if you listen to the perpetrators, if you listen to them, there's a logic. I'm not justifying it. That's very important. I don't want that to be taken out of context.
Right.
But the arguments they make, even if they're based entirely on falsehoods, if they're made entirely based on propaganda, conspiracy theories, etc., there is an A and a B, and it works. On some level, it works. The logic of this kind of genocidal violence. So if the Conestogas are informing Pontiac, we can't let that happen. We're going to treat them as an enemy in a war. We're going to wipe them all out. But that starts to fall apart when they're in the middle of Lancaster and then they're celebrating in the middle of the street. You see how it kind of,
yeah.
There's a kernel of logic and then it doesn't hold up. But there is a logic to their thinking. And I think that's my answer. Like I kind of, once you start to notice the threads and the similar elements, you start to go, okay, you could be a bit more clinical about it. And that's only because I've been studying genocide since high school. I've been doing this for a while. And at some point, that's sort of where you get set into it. I do not suggest most people study genocide if they're worried about the darker parts of history. But that's where I've settled into.
Well, I thank you so much for your time, Michael, and I really appreciate your words here. And I'm so happy that when I put the call for papers out, you were one of the first ones to throw your hat in the ring. So it was so good to have you on here on this live stream presentation, and I'm sure a lot of people will get a lot out of it. And the next time I ever end up in my home state, I'm gonna take in some of these sites and see something a little different than I'm used to going to when I'm in my area of the world.
Well,
thank you. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, you've inspired me to go and check out some of this stuff because it's important and these stories need to be told, obviously. And I thank you again for that, Michael. Thank you to everybody who has joined us for Michael's talk and for any talk today. We've had a great series today, and I appreciate each and every one of you. Please be good to yourselves and those around you. Keep reading, everybody, and I will chat with you later.